Let's start with, I think, it always is most interesting to start with the pain. So, you know, we're here at this event, there's 3,000-ish people or whatever here that are all here trying to sort out how do we create a better workplace for human beings. Through the lens of your work, and the work you've done and the clients you're working with, what do you see is kind of the primary challenge or struggle that they're facing right now in creating a more human or engaging work experience?
Well, I think you know, Jason, what we're finding is in the research is that our relationships to group is really the primary relationship in our lives. Maslow was wrong. The new neuroscience and cognitive science shows us that people's need for belonging, to feel like they fit in, is really our primary need. And it makes sense if you think about it. You know, what's the most vulnerable time of a person's existence is a newborn baby, and we can't survive for the first several years of our lives if we don't belong to somebody. Somebody's not taking care of us, and so we're hardwired with the sense that I exist because you exist. And I think the challenge that we have in a lot of workplaces is people come to those workplaces, and rather than people getting a sense of who are we and how can we create community here, who are we and how can we learn to interact, how can we learn to create a sense of bonding and bridging with each other, what we often do is we say, you fit in this way. And we create our structures much more transactionally rather than from a human perspective, and then we try to squeeze people into that. And you know, when you try to put round pegs into square holes, sometimes a smaller round peg will fit into the square hole, but that doesn't mean it's a good match.
Right.
And so as a result of that, in many cases, the people who are the most creative, the most likely to bring a different idea, a new way of looking at things, and the people who most struggle with not fitting in are the people who suffer the most.
Sure. So that resonates with me, that central, I talk about engagement sort of being really about, or work being about a relationship, understanding work as a relationship is sort of in the same realm. How do you know, I think part of the challenge is we've got, 100 years of sort of management theory or structure that has helped us arrive at this place where we try to squeeze people into these boxes. How do you recommend, like, when you're trying to start undoing that, to start creating an environment that fosters belonging and inclusion and connectedness? Where does that start? How do you start the process?
Well, I mean, it's like anything else. I mean, I think it starts from the end, and that is you have to have a real vision of what that looks like. And many organizations move more iteratively, kind of looking at what's going on now and how do we fix that, how do we move it forward, as opposed to what could it look like if we really created the kind of organization we want, and how do we then build from the future? So how do we build towards that way of looking at things? And that involves having a very clear vision and a very clear sense of purpose, and also articulated ideas of what that shows, how that shows up behaviorally. I mean, everybody these days has a vision statement or a mission statement, but more often it's on the walls than in the halls. So how do we really articulate that? What does it mean, for example, to have integrity in this organization? What does it mean to treat each other with respect or kindness or generosity or whatever it is? So I think that's a piece of it. And then I think the second piece is we have to be willing to engage with people as humans. So we say we want humans to come to work, but how much time do we give people, for example, to share their narrative, to share the path that got them to where they are? How much time do we have to share with them what are their concerns and fears? Because we know these are the things that motivate human behavior. If you and I can sit here and argue about something, I mean, I like to use a very simple example. My wife likes to sleep with the window open, I like to sleep with it closed. We used to wrestle back and forth about this. One day we said, what is this about? She said, I just need the fresh air and I like it a little bit cooler. I said, I need it a little bit warmer and it's too noisy. We get an electric blanket that can heat one side of the bed and not the other, and a good set of earplugs, and it's handled. But until we get underneath to find the why, and I think not too often, especially now because people feel so pressured, we're so focused on getting the job done and being transactional that we don't take the time for those conversations and realize that if we did, people would be much more productive when we make up that time anyway.
Sure. Is that when you start down that path? So, vision, and I'll set aside for a minute. I'm going to ask a question about that. But as far as when you start trying to have that more human interaction or peel back, is it a mindset challenge? Is it a skill set challenge? Because it seems like it exists on multiple levels. So when we start doing that in the organization, like, learning how to do it in your marriage takes time, right?
That's right.
Much less when you're at work with all the power dynamics. So where do you start working? What's the point of entry to make progress on that?
Well, there are usually, for me, three distinctions that we're always working at. The first is the cognitive behavioral piece, like what should we know and what do we know we need to do? So that's where skills and knowledge come into place. Okay. And the second is the emotional piece. And that is, how is this impacting people emotionally, and what are we trying to communicate emotionally as a culture? And then the third is the more challenging piece, which is the ontological piece, and that is how are we being about the subject? And so most organizations focus almost exclusively on the cognitive and behavioral piece. Sure. Let me give you the information, let me tell you what to do. But in actuality, the other two pieces are more important. You know, think about personal change. You know, dieting is a great example. We know obesity is a huge problem. I've had times in my life struggled with my weight. What I noticed was when I was 40 pounds heavier than I am now, I knew exactly what to do. I had all the information in the world. I used to run a wellness program in a hospital. Didn't do me a damn bit of good because I wasn't in touch with what was the emotional state that had me eat. In my case, it's related to stress. And what's the mindset, the ontological piece, the mind frame that I have. And I think that if we realize that the right behavior evolves from those emotional and ontological pieces more than the reverse. Sure. And so those are the things we need to focus on. And because a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about things like this at work, we do have to develop skills and create structures that allow them to feel safe doing it.
Sure. So does that work start with, because you know the traditional sense is you start with the leaders, right? If you can get leaders doing this work, it models and cascades from there. Has that been your experience, or is it, because that feels like pretty heavy work, pretty serious, hard work? Is it, does that need to start at the leadership level, and how does it look? Is it coaching? Is it training? Is it?
Well, in terms of the last part, yes, it's all of those things. It's coaching, it's training, it's conversations, it's dialogue. You know, I think that there's no question that if you have a leader who's, particularly one who's respected in the organization, and they say, let's go, that it's a huge asset. There's no question about that. But I also say to people all the time, you have to go in where the door's open. And I've had big projects that I've worked in, big change projects that started with one work team, one manager or mid-level person who brought me in to work with their team, and that was so successful that other people said, I want some of what they're doing. And then it ends up spreading like that. It's a little bit like zoysia grass. You know, you put the plug and it spreads out around itself. And so I think that what we need to do is we need to avoid using as an excuse that the leader is not on board yet. We need to go in, like I said, where the door's open. Now, if you have a leader who's hostile to the idea, and you're trying to bring something into the organization, then you know your change process becomes an antibody to the system, and that's going to be problematic. And then you have to really stop and think to yourself, is this really a possibility here? So I'm not talking about the extreme resistance kind of thing. But mostly leaders, you know, attitude is not so threatened by that. It's more like they're not ready to go there yet. But if you then come to them and say, hey, look, we did this with this division of 400 people, and look at the results it's producing, all of a sudden the leaders wake up. Yeah. It's like, how did you do that? Exactly right. Can we do that again? Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, last question is, and I know this is always an oversimplification, but I always like to think about, you know, if someone's listening that's a manager or a leader of a team, and they're thinking about this work and they are compelled to want to make some progress, are there some things that are fairly a simple place to start, or a tip or a piece of advice that you'd like to offer? Like, okay, here's something, if you start doing this now, you can start having immediate impact, or start taking a step in the right direction.
I mean, I think that the first thing you do is talk to people and sit down and say to people, you know, tell me what your experience is here. You know, how are you challenged? What do you like? You know, the start, stop, and continue conversation. Sure. But for some leaders, just being able to have an honest conversation like that requires breaking through some stuff. And it doesn't mean that the leaders necessarily have been bad or wrong or anything like that, because sometimes as employees or associates, we come in and we project all kinds of stuff on leaders. You know, we make them our father and our mother, and if we had a good father or a good mother, that's great. And if we had a bad father or a bad mother, then our approach to them is like this. Sure. You know, but I do think that ultimately listening to what people's concerns are, and then coming up with a vision that encompasses, you know, what's needed for all. I think this is where diversity plays an important role, because in a lot of cases, the people who are making the decisions about what the company looks like are not the same kind of people who work in the company. It might be people more who look like you and I at the top, but far more diverse in the lower levels of the organization. Right. I like to say that if diversity is inviting people to the dance and inclusion is getting them to actually be allowed to dance, belonging is when they actually get to choose some of the music. Right. And that's when I think you begin to create cultures in which people feel engaged, because they feel like their voice matters, it's representing them, and it's going to take them in a direction that they really want to go.
Cool. It's great stuff.
Yeah.
Howard, thank you very much.
Thanks
you,
Jason.
For sharing some time.
I appreciate it. Yeah, my pleasure.